The moment Olive Fletcher raised her hand at the Harding County livestock auction in the dry summer heat of 1882, every man on those wooden bleachers turned to stare at her like she had lost every last scrap of her mind. The stallion standing in the dusty ring below was not a horse anyone with good sense would have wanted. He was a dark bay with a coat gone dull and patchy from neglect, his ribs pressing visible against his hide like fingers trying to push through worn leather. His left foreleg bore a thick, ugly scar from an old wire injury that had healed badly, and he moved with a slight hitch in his gait that told the world he had been pushed too hard for too long on ground that had no mercy in it. His mane was matted, his eyes were wary and sunken, and he stood in the center of that ring with his head hanging just low enough to say that he had given up expecting anything good to happen to him. The auctioneer, a squat, red-faced man named Dwyer who had been calling bids in Harding County for 15 years, had already let the silence stretch out an uncomfortable length of time before Olive's hand went up. He had called the animal's merits with considerably less enthusiasm than he brought to a winning colt, stumbling through phrases like mature animal, experienced trail horse, potential for light work, while the crowd either looked away or whispered to each other behind their hands. Two men near the back had already laughed openly. Nobody had bid, nobody until Olive. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years, wearing a plain calico dress the color of sagebrush that was clean but not fashionable, and boots that had walked more miles of Wyoming territory than most men in that crowd had ridden on horseback. She sat in the third row of the bleachers without fidgeting, without fanning herself even in the brutal August heat, and she watched that horse with an expression on her face that was entirely unreadable to anyone who did not know her well, which was most people in that town. Her bid was $4. Dwyer blinked. He looked at her over the rims of his reading spectacles and said, louder than necessary, $4 from the lady in the third row. Do I have 5? Anyone? $5 for this fine. He stopped himself from using the word fine too generously. $5 for this animal, folks. Anyone? Nobody moved. Sold, said Dwyer without much ceremony, to Miss Fletcher for $4. There was murmuring. There was the particular kind of murmuring that a small western town reserves for a woman doing something that nobody quite understands but everybody has an opinion about. Olive did not look at the crowd. She stood, smoothed the front of her dress, tucked her small coin purse back into her basket, and walked down the bleacher steps toward the ring. She did not see Peter Alden until she was already at the gate. He was standing just inside the ring with the lead rope in his hand, and the expression on his face was not mockery or amusement or the polite blankness that men sometimes put on when they were trying very hard not to laugh. It was something more complicated than any of those things. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, wearing a hat that had been shaped by sweat and weather until it was entirely his own, and his eyes were the color of creek water over gray stone, a particular kind of blue-gray that changed depending on the light. There was a scar along his jaw, faint and old, and his hands on the rope were calloused and careful. He was the horse's owner. He had registered the animal with Dwyer 3 days ago and driven the stallion in from his ranch outside of town. His ranch was called the Alden Spread, 500 acres of grassland and dry creek bed south of Carver, Wyoming, and he had been working it alone since his father died 2 years prior, and his brother had gone east to study medicine and never come back west. Peter looked at Olive Fletcher standing at the gate, and he said, simply and without preamble, "Why?" Olive looked at him. She looked at the horse. She looked back at him. "Why what?" she said. "Why did you bid on him?" It was a fair question, and also, she understood immediately, a genuine one. He was not asking it to embarrass her or to challenge her. He was asking it because he genuinely wanted to know, and that quality of honest curiosity was not something she had encountered very often from men in the Wyoming territory, where most men asked questions as a way of making a point rather than seeking an answer. She set down her basket on the fence rail. She looked at the horse again, at the way he stood with his weight shifted carefully off that scarred left leg, at the particular angle of his head, at the slight tremble that moved through his flanks now that he was aware of people approaching. "Because he knows what it is to be pushed past what is fair," she said. "And I think he has got more in him than what anyone is seeing today. I have got a small place north of the creek, about 40 acres, and I do not need a racing animal or a show horse. I need a horse that will work with me, and I think he might be willing to do that if someone is patient with him." Peter Alden was quiet for a moment. The sun beat down on the ring, and somewhere behind them, a different horse was being led in for the next lot. Dwyer's voice started up again in his practice cadence. "You know he might not recover that leg fully," Peter said. "I know that. He has thrown 2 hands at my ranch. Not mean thrown, not vicious, but spooked badly and thrown. He is not easy." "He is scared," Olive said, and her voice was calm and very certain, the way someone sounds when they are stating a simple fact rather than making an argument. "That is different from being dangerous." Peter handed her the lead rope. His fingers brushed hers on the exchange, and she noticed it, though she gave nothing away on her face. He noticed it too. $4, he said. "That is what you paid." "That is what I paid." He reached into his vest pocket and held out the receipt Dwyer's boy had brought over from the booth. "Then he is yours, Miss Fletcher," she said. "Olive Fletcher." "Peter Alden," he said. They shook hands with the lead rope still between them, and the horse shifted and blew out a long breath through his nose, and Olive thought that for a moment, just briefly, something in the animal's posture changed, not fully, not dramatically, but the way a door that has been shut hard sometimes settles a fraction of an inch open in the night when the temperature changes. She led the horse out of the ring and through the market grounds toward the road north, and she felt Peter Alden's eyes on her back for a long way, though she did not look behind her. She would think about that later, she told herself. For now, she had a horse to get home. His name, she decided somewhere on that dusty road, would be Ajax, because it was a proud name, and she believed in giving proud names to things that had not been treated proudly. Ajax walked beside her with his head low and his steps cautious, but he did not pull at the rope, and when she talked to him in her quiet, steady way, his ears moved toward her voice. By the time they reached her property, a small homestead with a solid but modest house, a barn that leaned slightly to the east but was structurally sound, and a paddock with good fencing. He was walking with a fraction more ease in his movement, and she could not say whether it was the flat ground or the lack of noise, or simply the rhythm of walking beside someone who expected nothing from him just yet. She put him in the paddock with fresh water and good hay, and left him alone for the rest of the evening, watching him from the house with her supper plate on her knee. That was Wednesday. On Thursday morning, Peter Alden rode up her lane on a fine roan mare, which was such a contrast to poor Ajax that it made Olive almost smile before she had finished being surprised by the visit. He took his hat off when he reached her porch, which she appreciated, and he said that he had come to check whether the horse had arrived safely and whether she had any trouble on the road. It was a thin excuse for a visit, and both of them knew it. "He arrived fine," she said, from the porch steps where she had been reading. She held her place in the book with her thumb. "Come and see him if you like." Peter swung down from the mare and tied her to the porch post and followed Olive around to the paddock. Ajax was standing in the far corner, watching them approach with his ears pricked but his body tense. He did not run. He did not kick. He watched. "He has been eating well," Olive said. "He drank nearly a full bucket last night. I think he was badly dehydrated." Peter leaned on the paddock rail and watched the horse. Something moved in his face that Olive caught from the corner of her eye, something uncomfortable and honest. "I should not have let him get like that," he said. "I had a man working the ranch through spring who was not what I needed him to be. I did not know how bad things had gotten with this horse until I went out to the east pasture field one morning and saw him." "What happened to the man?" "I let him go," Peter said. 3 months ago, but the damage was done." He looked at Ajax a moment longer. I should have sold him to someone sooner before the auction, and I meant to, but somehow I kept thinking I would fix it myself. Get him right again before I sold him." He paused. "I did not manage it. And then I needed the money for a new fence line, and I ran out of time." Olive listened to this without interrupting. She had a quality of listening that made people say more than they intended to, not because she pressed or prompted, but simply because the silence she offered was open rather than empty, inviting rather than demanding. She had been told by more than one person that it was disconcerting. She suspected this was a compliment. "You feel guilty," she said, not unkindly. Peter looked at her sidelong. "I suppose I do." "Then here is what you can do about it," she said. "You can tell me everything you know about him. When he was foaled, what his gait was like before the injury, what he responds to, what frightens him, what he was trained on. Everything. That will be more useful to him than guilt." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somehow both surprised and rueful, as though she had said something that cut the nonsense out of the situation so cleanly that he could not find a way to be anything but grateful for it. They sat on the paddock fence for nearly an hour while he told her everything he knew about Ajax, and she listened with absolute attention and asked sharp, specific questions. And by the end of it, the horse had come 4 steps closer to the fence on his own without either of them encouraging him. Peter noticed. "He does not do that with most people," he said. "He is curious," Olive said. "He has always been curious. You said so yourself. You said when he was young he was the first one to investigate anything new in the pasture. I said that about 20 minutes ago and you already folded it in." "I listened carefully," she said simply. "He came back on Saturday. He had no particular excuse this time and did not pretend to have one. He brought a tin of liniment for Ajax's leg, which was useful, and she accepted it without making the visit into something awkward. They worked with the horse together for 2 hours, moving slowly and carefully, letting Ajax set the pace, and there were moments of genuine progress. A moment when the horse let Peter lay a hand on his neck without flinching, which was something Peter said had not happened in months. Afterward, Olive made coffee on the stove and they sat at her kitchen table and talked about ranching, about the territory, about the drought that had been threatening the northern grasslands for 2 seasons running. Peter told her about the mechanics of running a 500-acre spread alone, which was grueling work for one person, and she told him about the 40-acre homestead she had come into when her father passed 2 years ago, the same year she had moved back from the town of Sheridan where she had been working as a school teacher. "You gave up teaching?" he asked. "The school was closed," she said. "Budget," they said. The county commissioners decided that the students in that district could be served by the school in the next town, which was 11 miles away. "So I came back here. The land was here. It was mine." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I grew up on this place. My father ran cattle here until things got too hard and he sold the herd and kept only the horses. He died with no debt, which was a kind of miracle." She smiled at that, a small private smile. "I am keeping it going the way he would have wanted." "On your own?" Peter asked, and his voice was not doubtful or disparaging. He was genuinely asking. "On my own," she confirmed. "That is a hard life." "Most honest lives are," she said. He looked at her then with the particular quality of attention that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. The quality of a man who was listening not just to the words but to the person underneath the words, measuring something internal, evaluating not for weakness or strength but for truth. She did not look away from it. She never looked away from things that were looking directly at her. He came back on the following Tuesday with a fence tool she had mentioned needing in passing, which she had not thought he had noted, and she understood then that this was a man who remembered everything. They repaired a section of her north fence together, while Ajax grazed in the paddock, and they talked about the new territorial legislation that was making things difficult for small landholders across Wyoming, about the beef prices that had dropped through the floor the previous winter, about the railroad coming through, and what it would do to the small towns along its route, whether it would save them or slowly starve them by making everything move faster and bigger and farther away. Peter had opinions. They were considered opinions, not rash ones, and they were sometimes different from Olive's opinions, and she liked that. She had known too many men who shaped their views to match whatever room they were standing in. Peter Alden shaped his views from the inside out. By the second week, the visits had become a kind of pattern, and the pattern had become something both of them looked forward to without fully admitting it to themselves or each other. There was a deliberateness to the way they were moving toward each other, the way you might approach a wary animal yourself carefully, without sudden movements, with patience that cost something but was worth paying. Ajax was improving visibly. Olive had devised a regimen of gentle exercise in the mornings, careful grooming sessions in the afternoon, and the liniment on the leg every evening. She talked to him constantly while she worked, not commanding or cajoling but simply narrating, telling him what she was going to do before she did it, telling him what she saw when she looked at him, which was never a list of deficiencies but always a description of what was there and what was possible. On the 14th day after the auction, Ajax let her put a saddle on his back for the first time. She did not ride him. She just let him wear it for 20 minutes while she stood nearby and kept her voice steady and her movements slow. And when she took it off, he turned his head and pressed his nose briefly against her shoulder, just for a second, and then pulled away as though he had not done it. She was standing there with her hand raised to touch his neck when she heard boots on the paddock rail behind her, and turned to find Peter watching with an expression that was difficult to categorize, something warm and wondering at once. "Did you just see that?" she said, and she was smiling, a real unguarded smile that she had not planned to give anyone that afternoon. "I saw it," he said. The warmth in his voice was something that settled into the afternoon air the way wood smoke does, present and pervasive, and she turned back to Ajax to give herself a moment to breathe evenly again because she had just understood, standing there in the hot August Wyoming sun, that she had developed feelings for Peter Alden with a thoroughness that was going to require some serious thinking about. She was not afraid of feelings. She had had them before. But she had also learned that feelings unexamined had a way of pulling you off course before you knew you were moving, and she had worked too hard and too long on a course she had deliberately chosen to let herself be pulled sideways by something as unpredictable as this. She needed to think. She thought about it that night, sitting at the table after supper with the lamp burning low. She was 26 years old. She had a homestead she had chosen to keep, work she believed in, a horse she was rehabilitating, a life of hard and honest labor that she had built herself. She was not looking for a man to save her from any of that, not because she was opposed to partnership, but because she did not need saving and therefore had never organized her life around seeking rescue. But she was also not opposed to love. She had never been opposed to love. Her parents had loved each other well and thoroughly, with respect and humor and daily small acts of consideration. And she had grown up understanding that love between two people was not a destination you arrived at, but a practice you engaged in, endlessly and deliberately, the way you tended a garden, not because it sustained itself, but because sustained attention was the whole point. Peter Alden was a man worth paying attention to. She had known that within the first 30 minutes of meeting him. The question was whether he felt the same about her, and the question after that was whether both of them were brave enough to say so out loud, which was a different kind of courage from physical courage and in some ways harder. The next morning he came by earlier than usual before she had finished her first coffee, and he sat at her table without being invited to because by this point they were past the formality of invitations, and he wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. She pushed across to him and said, without looking up from the cup, "I have been thinking about something." "So have I," she said. He looked up at that. "What have you been thinking about?" he asked. "What have you been thinking about?" she said back. He laughed, a short, genuine sound that broke the morning seriousness. "I asked first," he said. She sat across from him. She folded her hands on the table in that composed way of hers that was never coldness but was always self-possession, and she looked at him directly and said, "I have been thinking that I have grown very fond of your company, and I have been wondering whether that is mutual or whether I have been telling myself a story." Peter set down his cup. He looked at her with those gray-blue eyes and said, "It is very mutual, Olive. It has been mutual since you stood at that auction ring and told me he was scared and not dangerous." The sound of her name in his voice was different from the sound of any other voice saying it. She registered this with the clear-eyed precision she brought to most things. "Well," she said, "then I suppose we should be deliberate about that." "Deliberate," he repeated, and the way he said it, quiet and sure, told her that he understood exactly what she meant, which was not a courtship conducted as a performance for the town to observe and evaluate, but a real and considered thing between two people who were taking it seriously. "Deliberate," she confirmed. He reached across the table and covered her folded hands with one of his. His hand was large and very warm and calloused from real work, and she looked down at it and then up at his face, and she thought that this was the kind of thing her mother had told her she would know when it was real, not because it was without complexity or uncertainty, but because it felt like arriving somewhere you had been heading without knowing it. "All right," he said. "Deliberate." The autumn came into the Wyoming territory that year with the particular thoroughness it had in the high country, all at once, as though someone had turned a page, the grass going from gold to brown overnight, and the air acquiring a cold clarity that made everything feel both farther away and more present. The aspens on the ridge behind Olive's place went yellow and then bare over the course of 2 October weeks, and the cottonwoods along the creek dropped their leaves in great pale drifts that gathered along the fences. Ajax was a different horse by October. He was not fully healed. The leg would never be entirely what it had been, and Olive had accepted that without sorrow or impatience, the way she accepted most hard facts, which was by building her plans around what was true rather than what would have been convenient. But he carried himself differently now. His coat had come in thick and healthy for the season, the dull patches gone, and his eyes had a brightness to them that she had not seen at the auction. He moved with purpose rather than apology, and while he was still cautious about new situations, his caution was now the caution of a thinking animal rather than a traumatized one. She had ridden him twice by then, short rides, carefully chosen ground, nothing demanding. Both times had gone beautifully, with a communication between horse and rider that she had worked months to build, and that felt, when it was working, like something close to music. Not the dramatic music of a gallop across open range, but the quiet music of a conversation between two beings who understood each other. Peter watched the second ride from the paddock fence with his arms crossed, and his expression the particular kind of still that she had learned meant he was moved but not going to make a production of it. "He is going to be good," Peter said, when she brought Ajax to the rail. "He is already good," Olive said, patting the horse's neck with genuine affection. Peter looked at her from beneath the brim of his hat. "Yes," he said, in a voice that was about more than the horse. "He already is." She looked at him from up on Ajax's back, and the afternoon light was low and gold the way it gets in October in the Wyoming high country, throwing long shadows across everything. And she thought that she was very happy in this specific moment in a way that was not loud or spectacular, but was bone-deep and completely real. They had been seeing each other in the deliberate way she had proposed throughout September and into October, which meant that their time together had a quality of intention to it. They were not simply falling into proximity. They were choosing each other's company with the specific awareness that they were choosing, which made ordinary things feel weighted with meaning. A meal shared at her table. A Sunday afternoon spent riding the perimeter of his land, while he told her the history of every fence post and gate, which sounds like a dull subject but in his telling was not, because he carried the history of that land in him, the way you carry anything you have loved for a long time, with a kind of aching familiarity. She told him about her years in Sheridan, about the school and the children she had taught there, some of whom she still received letters from a girl named Maddie who was now 14 and wanted to be a doctor, a boy named Samuel who had written to tell her he had read all 5 of the books she had recommended him before he left the school. She told him about her father, who had been a steady and dignified man with a dry humor and an absolute refusal to complain, and who had taught her everything practical she knew about horses and land and the particular ethics of honest work. She told him about her mother, who had died when Olive was 17, and about how grief changes shape over time but never entirely goes away, and you learn to carry it rather than set it down. Peter told her about his brother Thomas, who was in Philadelphia now, doing what he had always wanted to do but who had left a hole in the ranch's daily life that Peter had never quite filled. "We right," Peter said. "That is something. But it is not the same as having someone working the east pasture when you are working the west one." "No," Olive agreed. "Proximity matters. The actual physical presence of people you love matters." He looked at her when she said that, and she held his gaze, and the word love hung in the air between them, applied to his brother but resonating with something larger, and neither of them felt the need to address it directly because they were both people who understood that some things say themselves by the way the air changes around them. It was a Saturday in late October, 2.5 months after the auction, that Peter came by in the early afternoon while she was patching the leaning east wall of her barn, an ongoing project that required more stubbornness than skill, though she had developed both over the years. He took off his coat and handed it to her and picked up the other hammer without being asked, and they worked together for 3 hours in the crisp fall air until the wall was stable, and when they stopped they were dusty and tired and warm from exertion, and he looked at her in the fading afternoon light and said, "Olive, I would like to ask you something." She set down her hammer. She brushed sawdust from her sleeve. She waited. "I know I want to be direct with you because I have learned that direct is what you respect, and I respect that about you, and I have come to respect you honestly more than anyone I know." He was not nervous in a theatrical way, but there was something careful in his voice, the way someone is careful with something they do not want to break. "I would like to court you properly." Which I know is a word that might seem, I know we have been, but I mean in the sense of asking your permission to do this openly and with the intention of, "Yes," Olive said. He stopped. "Yes. Yes," she said again, and there was something in her voice that was both composed and entirely warm, which was very Olive. "I would like that." He let out a breath that might have been held since he started the sentence. Then he reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back behind her ear where it had come loose from her pin during the hammering, and his fingers rested at her jaw just briefly, and she placed her hand over his and held it there for a moment. The first time he kissed her was not that day. It was 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening when he had stayed for supper, and they were standing on her porch afterward, watching the stars come out over the Wyoming range, which is a thing that deserves attention because a clear October night in the Wyoming Territory is one of the most extraordinary things the natural world produces. The stars so abundant and present that they seem not so much above you as all around you. He had been standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, and she had been telling him about how her father used to name the constellations in both the Latin and the common names, and insisted on the Latin being remembered too because, he said, knowing something's true name was a form of respect, and she had turned her head to look at Peter as she said it and found him already looking at her. He asked with his eyes first, a very slight questioning that she answered by not moving away, and then he kissed her, carefully and with full presence, one hand coming up to her face, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which turned out to be considerable. When they separated, the stars were still there, indifferent and magnificent, and Olive thought she would remember this specific configuration of events for the rest of her life. "I have wanted to do that," Peter said, his voice low, for approximately 2 months. You could have done it sooner, she said. I wanted to be sure you wanted it too. I told you 2 months ago that your company was mutual. Wanting someone's company and wanting to be kissed by them are not always the same thing. She looked up at him. In this case they were, she said. He smiled at that. Not the brief, polite smile she had seen him give other people, but the full, real one that she had discovered he reserved for moments of genuine pleasure, which were not as frequent for him as she wished they were. Not because he was an unhappy man, but because he was a serious one who had carried a lot of weight alone. The town of Carver, Wyoming, population approximately 400 people in 1882, had the usual appetite for other people's business that small western towns develop, when there is not enough of their own business to keep everyone occupied. And the courtship of Olive Fletcher and Peter Alden became a subject of considerable interest over the course of that autumn and into the early winter. Most of the opinion was favorable, though it traveled through the town's opinion-forming apparatus, the dry goods store, the church porch on Sunday mornings, the counter at the barber shop, with various additions and embellishments that bore only a loose relationship to the facts. The widow Hargreaves, who had lived across the road from Olive's north fence for 40 years, told anyone who asked that she had expected it from the moment she saw Olive walk home from that auction leading that sorry-looking horse. Because a woman who sees potential in a broken-down animal is a woman who sees potential in broken-down things generally. And she had also seen potential in Peter Alden from the moment his father died and left him with a too big ranch and too much pride to ask for help, both of which Olive's steady presence seemed to be quietly resolving. The widow Hargreaves was 81 years old and had been right about most things for most of her life, and Olive respected her accordingly. Peter's relationship with the town was more complicated. He was well respected. He was known as a fair man, an honest dealer, a reliable neighbor during hard times. But he was also somewhat reserved in the way that people who have been alone a long time become reserved, not through coldness, but through the habit of self-reliance that can make the ordinary gestures of social life feel unnecessary. Olive noticed that in her company he was less reserved than he seemed to be in town, that he talked more freely and laughed more easily, and she did not say anything about this for a while because she did not want to draw attention to something that might make him self-conscious. But one evening she did say, gently, "You know that you could let people see more of what you show me. They would like you better for it." He considered this seriously in the way he considered all things she said to him seriously. "I have not had much practice," he said. "Then you can practice," she said. "I will not keep score." He had laughed at that, the real laugh, and she had filed away the image of his face in that moment, the particular way it opened when something struck him as genuinely funny, because she was collecting these images of him without meaning to, the way you collect certain stones when you are walking along a creek bed, not deliberately, but because something in your hand keeps closing around the ones with particular weight and beauty. November in Carver brought the first real snow, which arrived on a Tuesday night and covered everything by morning with a white so complete and quiet that Olive stood at her kitchen window before dawn and felt the world had been remade. Ajax did not particularly like snow, she discovered, and she spent a good part of that first snowfall morning in the barn keeping him company and reading aloud from the novel she was working through, which was a recent copy of a Henry James story she had ordered from the bookseller in Sheridan, and which Ajax seemed to find no more objectionable than anything else she read to him. Peter showed up at noon with a wagon loaded with winter hay, which she had not asked for and would not have asked for, but which she accepted gracefully because it was genuinely needed, and because accepting help gracefully was something she believed in as much as she believed in providing it. "How did you know my stores were short?" she asked. "You mentioned last week that your North Bale stack was looking thin," he said. "I mentioned it once in passing." "I know," he said. "I told you I remember things." She put her hands on her hips and looked at him. "Peter Alden," she said. "Olive Fletcher," he said back, matching her tone exactly. And the way he said her name made her stomach feel warm in a way that she had now entirely stopped trying to reason herself out of, because it was simply part of her daily life, and she had decided to accept it as such. She helped him unload the hay into the barn while the snow fell softly around the yard, and Ajax watched them work from his stall with his large, intelligent eyes. And at one point when Olive was passing close to his stall, he reached his head out and pressed his nose to her cheek, a deliberate, unmistakable gesture of affection. And she put her forehead against his for a moment and closed her eyes. She heard Peter go still behind her. She opened her eyes and turned, and his expression was that still, moved look, and she saw with a slight shock of recognition that there were tears in his eyes, not falling but present, the kind that come from something striking the heart more directly than expected. "That horse was dying," he said quietly. "Not physically dying, but the spirit of him was dying. I watched it happening and I could not stop it, and it is one of the worst things I have ever felt." And now he stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I am very glad you bid $4 on him, Olive." She crossed the barn and stood before him and looked up at his face, at the complicated mixture of guilt and gratitude and something softer working in his expression. And she reached up and laid her hand against his jaw in the same place he had once laid his hand against hers on the porch, and she said, "He is all right now. You helped me give him that. Every visit, everything you told me about him. You helped." He covered her hand with his. They stood like that in the falling snow light in the hay-scented quiet of the barn, with Ajax watching them placidly from his stall, and the world outside was entirely white and silent, and Olive thought that this was love, not the word for it, but the actual substance of it, the thing itself, present and warm and real. December was hard, as December always was in Wyoming. The temperatures dropped to levels that made the days a matter of survival management, keeping the animals warm and watered, keeping the stove fed, keeping the ice broken on the troughs before it froze solid enough to be useless. Olive was competent at all of this. She had managed it alone for 2 winters, but managing it with Peter's help was different in ways both practical and emotional. He came every morning and every evening, which meant that the worst of the cold weather chores were shared, and sharing them meant they were simply chores instead of the kind of grinding alone labor that wears a person down to the bone over the months of a hard winter. They also shared evenings, long quiet evenings by her stove with books and conversation, and the easy silence of people who are comfortable enough with each other. That silence does not need to be filled. He had begun to bring things from his ranch. A photograph of his parents that he wanted her to see, a letter from Thomas that he wanted to read aloud to her, small tokens of his inner life that she understood, were significant offerings from a man who had kept his inner life very close for a long time. She showed him her father's journal, which she kept in the drawer of the kitchen table, a plain leather-bound book in which her father had recorded 50 years of weather, livestock notes, and occasional personal observations in his careful handwriting. Peter read it with a reverence that made her love him, and she knew when she thought the word that she was thinking the right word at last. She loved him. She had loved him for a while, possibly since the barn in November, possibly since the porch and the stars in October, possibly since the paddock fence in August when she had told him Ajax was scared, and not dangerous, and something in his face had shifted. She could not fix the precise moment because love is not precise. It is cumulative. It is the result of 1,000 small recognitions stacking on top of each other until the stack becomes something you can see and name. She had not said it yet, neither had he. They had been careful, deliberate, patient, the same qualities she had brought to rehabilitating Ajax, she thought, and found the comparison apt rather than unflattering, because the patience was rooted in the same thing, the conviction that what she was working toward was worth doing slowly and doing right. It was Christmas Eve, 1882, that Peter arrived at her door in the early evening with a clean shirt, and a bottle of elderflower cordial, which she knew he had obtained from Mrs. Gunderson at the Mercantile, and which she also knew was her particular favorite because she had mentioned it to him once in September. She had made a roast chicken and sweet potato and cornbread, and she had put pine boughs on the table and lit every candle she owned. And when he came in out of the cold, she saw his face change as he took in the lit room and the smells and her, in her good dress, the dark green wool one, and she thought she had made a good decision with the candles. After supper, they sat by the stove and she had her elderflower cordial, and he had the small whiskey she had also procured, because she was deliberate about things like that, and they talked about the year, about all the things that had happened since August, since a dry county livestock auction and a broken-down horse and a question asked honestly across a dusty ring. "I would not have guessed," Peter said, staring at the stove with his whiskey in both hands, "in August at that auction, where this was going." "I might have," Olive said, slightly. He looked at her, slightly. "There was something about the way you asked why," she said, not challenging, genuinely wanting to know. "I thought, this is an honest man, and I find myself very susceptible to honest men." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set his whiskey down on the table beside him and turned to face her fully, the firelight doing things to the angles of his face that she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for some time, and I have been waiting until I was sure you were ready to hear it, and I believe you are." She looked at him steadily. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since approximately November, and I have been waiting until it felt exactly right to say so, and it feels exactly right now." He took her hand. He held it in both of his with a gentleness that was very characteristic of him, the careful hands, the attention. "Then I would like," he said slowly, "to ask you something important, and I want to ask it properly, not impulsively." "Ask it," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the ranch, not because of practical considerations, not because of anything other than the fact that I want to spend my life with you, and I believe you would do me the honor of telling me the truth always, which is the thing I respect most in the world, and you are the person I most want beside me when things are easy and when things are hard, which they will be because they always are." He paused. "Olive Fletcher, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. The stove ticked. Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed against the windows. Ajax was in the barn with fresh hay and water, 3 months recovered from the horse he had been, becoming more himself every day. "Yes," she said. "I will." He exhaled. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formal tenderness that made her eyes feel warm. Then he looked up at her and she reached forward and kissed him, long and real, and he wrapped his arms around her and she let herself be held, which was something she did not often allow but which she allowed now completely, because she had chosen this deliberately and she was going to be deliberate about all of it, including this. They were married in the spring. The date was April 14th, 1883, chosen in part because by April the land was waking up again, and Peter said he wanted to marry her when the grass was coming back, which she understood as the rancher's version of optimism, and accepted it on those terms. The wedding was in the Carver Church, which was a small plain building with good light through the eastern windows in the mornings, and Reverend Cole, who was a quiet and kind man, performed the ceremony with the simple language that suited both of them. Olive wore her good green dress with a new white collar she had sewn herself, and her hair down for the first time since Peter had known her, which made him look at her when she came up the aisle with an expression so unguarded that the widow Hargreaves, sitting in the front pew, was heard to say afterward that it was the most genuine face she had seen on a man in a church in her 81 years. Thomas Alden came from Philadelphia for the wedding. He was younger than Peter by 4 years, slighter in build with the same gray-blue eyes, and he embraced Olive when he met her and said, "He wrote to me about you in September. He said he had met a woman who told him a horse was scared and not dangerous, and that it had, his exact words were that it had turned something over in him." Thomas smiled. "I have been hoping to meet you ever since." "He is a letter writer of some quality," Olive said, which made Thomas laugh and Peter, standing nearby, go slightly red in a way that she found extremely endearing. There was a dinner after the ceremony at the hotel, which was the nicest establishment in Carver and ran to 4 tables on its best days, and the widow Hargreaves brought a cake, and the Gundersons from the Mercantile brought preserves, and Reverend Cole gave a toast that was thoughtful and genuine, and Peter held Olive's hand under the table for most of the meal in that quiet way of his that cost him nothing but said everything. Thomas stayed a week. He was good company, intelligent and warm, with a humor that surfaced in unexpected places, and his presence at the Alden ranch during that week filled something in Peter that Olive could see healing, a particular kind of loneliness that is specific to separation from a sibling, and that cannot be fixed by any other kind of connection. They stayed up late 2 nights talking, the 3 of them at the kitchen table of the Alden ranch house, which was now also Olive's house. Her place retained and working, Ajax stabled in the Alden barn where there was more room, her furniture integrated into the larger house with a naturalness that surprised her, as though her things and Peter's things had been waiting to be in the same rooms. She had thought the integration would feel stranger than it did. She had been independent for enough years that she had wondered whether she would find the close proximity of shared life difficult. She did not. Or rather, she found it occasionally difficult in the way that any honest close relationship is occasionally difficult, because 2 people with real characters and genuine opinions and particular habits cannot share space without friction now and then. And she had learned from her parents that the friction was not the problem, but how you worked through it. And working through it with Peter was something she found she was not only capable of but interested in. Because he brought the same honest attention to disagreements that he brought to everything else, and she respected that above almost anything. They disagreed in December 1883 about whether to expand the cattle herd that spring. Peter wanted to take on 30 more head. Olive thought the water situation on the south pasture was not resolved enough to support an expansion, and they had a genuine argument about it. 2 intelligent people with good information disagreeing genuinely, and they worked through it across 3 evenings of conversation, checking figures and walking the south pasture together, and talking to old Harlan Watts, who had ranched the county for 40 years and knew the water better than anyone, and in the end they landed on a compromise. 15 additional head with a new well dug on the south pasture boundary. Before the animals arrived, the well was dug in March. It was a good well. The cattle arrived in April and did well from the start. Olive did not say anything triumphant about the water concerns because she was not that kind of person, but Peter said, one evening that summer while they were sitting on the porch watching the cattle graze the south pasture in the golden late light, "You were right about the water. The 15 instead of 30 was right." "We were both right," she said. 30 would have been risky. 15 with the new well was sound. He leaned over and kissed her temple. "You are very gracious about being right," he said. "I have had practice," she said, and he laughed, and she leaned against him in the evening warmth, and Ajax was in the paddock visible from the porch, moving slowly and confidently, his coat brilliant in the good summer light. The question of land also resolved itself in 1884. Her 40-acre homestead north of the creek had continued to operate as a smaller satellite holding. She kept a garden there, and a small additional pasture for hay cutting, and the widow Hargreaves, whose property was nearest, had been keeping a friendly watch on it during the week. When the opportunity came to buy the 20 acres between the 2 properties, which had been belonging to a family named Brant who was moving to Oregon, Peter asked Olive directly what she thought, and she looked at the map and looked at her husband and said, "It would join our land to my father's land. It would mean this whole stretch of ground from the North Creek to the south pasture fence is ours." "Then we should buy it," Peter said immediately. "It will be expensive." "Less expensive than it will be in 10 years, he said, "and we can manage it." They managed it. The 20 acres of Brant land were added to the Alden holdings in the spring of 1884, and Olive walked the new boundary with Peter on a clear, cold morning in April, and felt something in her chest that was difficult to name, but was something like rightness. The rightness of things being in their proper places, of the work of years producing a result that matched the intention. In the summer of 1884, Olive became pregnant. She told Peter on a July morning over coffee, in the same kitchen where so much of their courtship had been conducted. And she told him directly and without ceremony because directness was her way, and he had always respected it. She watched his face carefully, having her own feelings about it that were complicated and genuine happiness present and real, but also the awareness that pregnancy in the Wyoming territory in 1884 was not a simple matter, that women died in childbed with a frequency that was ordinary and terrible, that she was 28 years old and healthy and strong, but that none of those things were guarantees. Peter's face when she told him went through several things very quickly, the way a summer sky goes through several configurations on a changeable day, the flash of joy first, unmistakable, and then the same shadow of awareness she had just noted, and then something that settled into steady, warm certainty. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I am well," she said. "A little queasy in the mornings, but not badly. I have been reading about it." She had, of course, obtained the most current guide she could find from the Sheridan bookseller, a medical text on obstetrics published in 1880, which she had read thoroughly and practically. "I want Dr. Fenwick involved from the beginning," Peter said. Dr. Fenwick was the physician in Carver, a competent man who had set bones and treated fevers for the county for 15 years. "Not just at the end." "Agreed," she said. "And I want Thomas to know. He knows more than Fenwick does. Honestly, his training is more recent and he would want to know." "Write to him today," she said. Thomas wrote back within the fortnight with 14 pages of considered medical advice, most of which was sound, and a separate letter to Olive that was warm and personal and made her laugh twice, and a promise to come for the birth if at all possible given his schedule in Philadelphia. The pregnancy was not easy in its second half. She developed a prolonged fatigue in the autumn months that was genuinely difficult, not just tiredness but an exhaustion that sat in her bones and made the daily work of the ranch feel like moving through water. She kept working because she could not be who she was without working, but she was more careful, and Peter was more careful around her. And when she noticed him watching her with that particular still expression that she knew meant he was calculating risk and managing worry, she told him plainly that she was all right and that he should tell her rather than watching her, because she preferred information to protection when it was her own health under discussion. He respected this. He told her what he observed and what he worried about, and she told him her own assessments, and Dr. Fenwick told them both what he knew, and they navigated it together as they navigated everything with honesty and attention, and the willingness to recalibrate based on new information. Thomas arrived 10 days before the expected date, which was in early March 1885, having taken the train west from Philadelphia and ridden up from the station at Cheyenne on a rented horse, arriving at the Alden ranch cold and dusty and very relieved to be there. His presence was a genuine comfort to both of them. His medical knowledge gave them more certainty about what was normal and what was not, and his humor and warmth eased the particular edge that Peter had been carrying in his jaw and shoulders for 2 months. The child was born on March 7th, 1885, after a labor that was long and hard but ended well. Olive was 30 years younger and strong, and she had prepared as thoroughly as a person could prepare for something that ultimately cannot be fully prepared for, and the result was a son, a broad-shouldered infant with dark hair and his father's hands, already visible in the wide span of his newborn fingers. Peter held him with the careful hands that held everything he loved, the same hands that had given her the lead rope of a broken-down horse in August of 1882, the same hands that had repaired her fence and steadied Ajax and covered her folded hands across a kitchen table on a cold morning in September. "He looks like you," Olive said from the bed, exhausted and very warm. "He has your chin," Peter said, not looking up from the child. What will we name him? Peter looked up at her. I have been thinking about that, he said. I thought your father's name. Her father's name had been Eli. Olive's eyes went warm in a way they did not often do publicly, but did not hide when they did. Eli, she said. Yes. Thomas, sitting in the chair by the window looking wrung out and relieved and quietly happy, said, Welcome to Wyoming, Eli Alden. It is going to be a very interesting life. Eli Alden turned out to be an extremely interested person from the very beginning, which Olive had suspected was inevitable given his parentage, and which proved accurate in every respect. He was a child who paid attention to everything, who had opinions about most things and was very willing to share them, and who by the time he was walking was following his father around the ranch with the purposeful air of someone taking notes. Ajax, who had continued to improve and was now by 1885 a genuinely excellent horse, not fast, not flashy, but steady and willing and extraordinarily responsive to Olive, took to the infant with the same thoughtful attention he brought to all of Olive's world. He was gentle around the child in the way that certain animals are gentle around small things, with a deliberateness that seemed to go beyond instinct into something more considered. In the spring of 1886, Olive and Peter had a conversation about the future of the ranch. It had grown between the original Alden land, the Fletcher homestead 40 acres, and the Brant acquisition. They were managing close to 600 acres of productive Wyoming ground, and the question of how it would be managed over the long term, whether they would eventually hire hands, or whether they would continue the partnership-intensive approach they had developed, was a real and practical question. They were sitting on the porch of a warm spring evening while Eli, now a year old and newly walking, conducted his investigative tour of the porch boards with enormous seriousness. Ajax was visible in the paddock. The grass on the south pasture was coming in thick this year, the water from the well they had dug holding through the dry spell. I think we need help, Olive said. Not immediately, but within the year. The herd is at a size where two people cannot safely manage it through the full season without running themselves into the ground. I have been thinking the same thing, Peter said. I was hesitant to say it. She looked at him. Why? I am not sure, he said. Some stubbornness, probably. My father ran this place with 2 hands and never complained about it. Your father ran a smaller herd on less land, Olive said. Yes, he admitted. And he had your mother, Olive said. And you and Thomas. He was quiet a moment. Fair point, he said. Hire the Ortega boy from town, she said. He is 17, he is hardworking, he knows horses, and he needs steady employment. By the time he is 18 and fully on his hands' wages, he will have learned enough to be genuinely useful. You have been thinking about this already, Peter said, with the particular expression he used when she produced a fully formed practical plan from a context where he had assumed they were only beginning to discuss the problem. I think about most things before I say them, she said. I know, he said, and his voice was warm and slightly rueful in the way it often was when she demonstrated this quality. It is impressive and occasionally frustrating. Only occasionally. Frequently, he said, and she laughed. Miguel Ortega came to work at the Alden spread in July 1886, and he was exactly what Olive had predicted: hardworking, willing, and good with the horses in a way that was natural and instinctive. He was also extremely interested in Ajax, who was the most unusual horse on the ranch, and Olive spent a Sunday afternoon showing him how she worked with the Stallion, explaining the approach she had developed over the past 4 years. Miguel listened the way she had listened to Peter at the auction ring, with genuine attention and no pretense. He was a thoughtful boy who did not speak unnecessarily, but when he did speak said things worth hearing. How did you know he could come back from it? Miguel asked, watching Ajax respond to Olive's quiet approach in the paddock. I did not know for certain, Olive said honestly. I believed it, based on what I could see in him. You can learn to read fear, and an animal fear is specific. It has a particular shape. And under the fear, if you look, You can often see what the animal is actually like when they are not afraid. She patted Ajax's neck. He was curious, even in the ring that day, even at his worst. A curious animal has not given up. Curious animals can come back. Miguel nodded slowly. He stored this away the way someone stores something they expect to use. Olive approved of this. By 1887, the Alden ranch was running well, not profitably enough to be wealthy, which was not what they sought, but soundly and sustainably, which was very much what they sought. Miguel had grown into a reliable hand who was becoming genuinely skilled, and Peter had taken to teaching him the fence and water management that he had learned from his father, which Olive watched with a quiet satisfaction because Peter was a good teacher when he gave himself the chance to be patient and specific, and demanding the right things. She was pregnant again by early 1887. She told Peter with the same directness as before, over the same kitchen table, and his response was the same as before: joy and care, an honest acknowledgement of the weight of it. But there was more ease in it this time, the ease of having navigated it once and knowing more about how to navigate it again. Thomas did not come this time. He was now a practicing physician with a full case roster who could not always manage the 5-day journey west, but he sent detailed correspondence, and his trust in Olive's good sense and the combined care of Peter and Dr. Fenwick, which was well placed. The second child was born in October 1887, a daughter, Nell, with Olive's dark chestnut hair and a voice, from her first hour, that was capable of carrying considerable distances. Peter held her with the same careful tenderness he had held Eli, and Eli, now 2.5, regarded her from the doorway of the bedroom with the precise skeptical expression of an eldest child encountering the fact of a sibling for the first time. "She is very loud," Eli observed. "She is very alive," Peter said. "That is good." Eli considered this. "All right," he said, accepting the logic. The years that followed were full in the way good years are full, not without difficulty, because difficulty was woven into the fabric of that life, and that land and that time, but full of the kind of meaning that comes from working toward something real with people you love and the land you have committed yourself to. Droughts came and were managed. A fence-cutting dispute with a neighboring ranch in 1888, part of the wider range wars that were roiling Wyoming in that period. The tensions between large cattle operations and smaller landholders reaching a pitch that made everyone nervous, was handled by Peter and Olive together, with Peter doing the direct negotiation, and Olive doing the particular kind of clear-eyed assessment of what they could and could not yield that made the negotiation possible. They did not lose their fence. They did not lose their good relationship with their neighbors, either, which mattered more in the long run. Olive wrote about the fence-cutting dispute in a letter to Thomas and described the broader situation with a precision that Thomas shared with several colleagues in Philadelphia who were interested in the development of the West. And Thomas wrote back to say that she should consider writing for publication, which she dismissed as impractical, but which she thought about more than she admitted. Ajax lived until 1891. He was not old as horses go, he was 14. But the early damage to his leg had taken years from what his life might have been, and in the spring of that year he began to decline in a way that she could see was not something that could be worked through with patience and liniment and care. Dr. Fenwick's son, who had taken on veterinary work in the county, confirmed what she already knew. She was with him at the end, on a warm May morning with the sun coming through the barn door and the sound of the ranch alive around them. She sat with him in the straw, and she talked to him the way she had always talked to him, steadily and truthfully, and without pretending. She told him what he had meant to her. She told him what he had been the beginning of. She told him that the 9 years from that auction ring had been the fullest of her life, and that he had been at the start of all of it. Peter was in the barn doorway, not intruding, just present. When it was over, she came out of the barn and he opened his arms and she walked into them and pressed her face into his neck. And she cried, not for long, not with drama, but with the genuine grief that the death of a beloved animal deserves, and that she gave fully because she had always believed in giving feelings the space they needed. "He had a good 9 years," Peter said, his chin on her head, his arms steady around her. "He did," she said. "He really did." Eli, who was 6 years old, asked many questions about where Ajax had gone that involved both philosophy and theology at a level of earnestness that reminded Olive so strongly of herself at that age that it made her almost laugh through the sadness. She answered him as honestly as she could, which was her approach to all of his questions, and he took it in with the same thoughtful storage that characterized him. And he planted a wildflower seed in the paddock where Ajax had spent his best years, and watched it grow through the summer with proprietary satisfaction. The wildflower was a purple prairie blazing star, which he had chosen from the seed packet at the mercantile with great deliberateness, and it came up and bloomed magnificently, and the following year it reseeded itself and came up again, and by the summer of 1893, there was a small natural garden of prairie blazing star in the corner of the old Ajax paddock that the whole family kept an eye on through the growing season. Olive took on a correspondence in 1892 with a women's property rights organization in Cheyenne. Wyoming Territory had granted women the right to vote in 1869 and continued to have more progressive land rights for women than most of the country. But there were still legal gaps and practical injustices that the organization was working to address, and Olive's particular combination of legal literacy, practical ranch knowledge, and direct, clear prose made her a useful contributor. She wrote 1 letter a week, sometimes 2, when the season allowed, and when the organization's representative came through Carver in the spring of 1893 and met with a small group at the church, Olive spoke clearly and practically about what legal changes would most directly affect women who were working the land, and Peter sat in the back of the room and listened with the expression she knew best, the attentive, moved, proud expression that he wore when she said something that was true and important in front of other people. In 1893, Thomas and his wife, a Boston-born woman named Clara who was a schoolteacher, and who Olive liked immediately and thoroughly, came west for the summer. It was the longest visit Thomas had made since Peter and Olive's wedding, and it was a full and happy summer. Clara and Olive discovered a shared interest in practical women's education that led to long evening conversations at the kitchen table. Thomas worked the ranch alongside Peter for a month, and the two brothers fell back into their old rhythms with an ease that made Olive feel glad down to her bones. And the children, Eli now 8 and Nell 5, followed their Uncle Thomas everywhere with the particular devotion of children for an adult who treats their questions as real questions deserving real answers. Clara and Thomas had no children yet, which was a matter they had accepted, and which Thomas mentioned once to Peter in an oblique way that Peter then mentioned to Olive. And she wrote to Clara about it in the kind of honest letter that Clara later told her she had kept and reread more than once in difficult moments. Because it was the kind of letter that was not about comfort so much as about truth, and the way truth, fully faced, becomes its own kind of comfort. By the autumn of 1893, the Alden Ranch was what it had been working toward being since 1882, a fully functioning, well-managed, deeply rooted operation on the Wyoming land, with a herd of 60 cattle, 20 horses, a working hay operation on the Fletcher pastures, and 2 people at its center who had been building it together for 11 years with honesty and work and love, and the kind of daily choice that makes something last. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, April 14, 1893, Peter and Olive sat on the porch in the April dusk, which was cold but not brutally so, and the children were inside with their supper, and the ranch was quiet in the particular way it was quiet at the end of a good day, everything settled and in its place. 10 years, Peter said. 10 years, Olive agreed. Do you remember the auction? I think about it often, she said. I think about standing at that ring and seeing him and knowing, not knowing everything, but knowing something. And I think about you asking why and how you asked it, and I think that the way you asked that question told me most of what I needed to know about you." "What did it tell you?" he asked. "That you wanted the true answer," she said. "Not confirmation of what you already thought. The true answer, whatever it turned out to be." That is, she turned her head to look at him, at the face she had been watching for 11 years now, which had changed as all faces change, but which was still entirely his, still entirely the face she had been studying and loving since that dry August afternoon. "That is the thing I love most about you. You have always wanted the true answer." He looked at her in the April dusk, and the expression on his face was the one she had collected so many times and that she would collect until the end, the full open expression. No reserve, just Peter Alden looking at Olive Fletcher Alden with everything he had and nothing held back. "You taught me that," he said. "You have been teaching me that since you told me he was scared and not dangerous." She reached over and took his hand in both of hers. He tightened his grip, steady and warm. "I did not teach you to want the truth," she said. "That was already in you. I just gave you practice." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, the same gesture as Christmas Eve 1882, and she closed her eyes for a moment and let the evening settle around them. The Wyoming night coming on, the stars beginning to appear in the east over the ridge, the children's voices drifting through the window from inside the house, the sound of the horses in the paddock, the smell of grass and cold air and wood smoke. In 1895, Nell started school in Carver and declared within the first month that she intended to become a writer, which did not surprise Olive in the least. Eli, at 10, was already deeply committed to the horses in a way that marked him as his mother's son in the ranch's tradition, and he had taken on real responsibility in the horse management, with a seriousness that Peter said, with quiet pride, was more than he himself had had at that age. Miguel Ortega had married by 1895 and brought his wife, Rosa, to work the household side of the ranch when Olive's writing work for the women's organization had grown to take more of her morning hours. Rosa was a capable and warm woman who improved the kitchen operations dramatically, and who became, over the years, a genuine friend to Olive in the daily way that real friendship between women working the same ground develops, slowly and practically, and without ceremony. The summer of 1896 brought a drought more serious than anything they had seen in 5 years. The grasslands turned brown earlier than usual, and the creek ran low, and there were weeks in July and August where the work of keeping the ranch viable was all-consuming. They made it through with careful management, culling the herd to a sustainable level before the worst of it hit, which was a financially painful decision, but the right one, using the south pasture well they had dug in 1883, which proved its worth that summer beyond anything else. And in October, when the rains came back and the land began to drink itself whole again, Olive and Peter stood at the south pasture fence and watched the grass begin to respond and felt the particular relief that is only available to people who have invested deeply in a piece of land and whose relationship to it is long enough and honest enough to understand both its fragility and its resilience. "We should plant more trees along the North Creek boundary," Olive said. "We should," Peter agreed, which was all either of them needed to say about it, because they had learned over 14 years of working together that decisions between them did not require extended negotiation when both parties could read the land and each other clearly enough. They planted 20 cottonwoods that fall along the North Creek boundary, and by 1900 the trees were established and provided real shade and wind break, and Olive told Nell, who was 12 and interested in everything, that the trees were a gift to whoever came after them on this land, which was the way you were supposed to think about the things you planted. In the final years of the 19th century, with the century turning and everything it meant, the sense of time accumulating and reckoning, the awareness of how much had happened in a single lifetime, the peculiar combination of backward-looking and forward-looking that a turn of century brings, Olive found herself doing what her father had done, keeping a record. Not a formal journal, but pages of notes and observations about the ranch, the land, the seasons, the horses, the decisions made and unmade, the things learned. She wrote about Ajax, which was something she had meant to do for years. She wrote about the auction, about the ring, about the question asked honestly and the honest answer given. She wrote about how a single decision made with good instincts on a hot August afternoon had set in motion 11 years of everything that mattered most to her, which was not a mystical observation but a practical one, because this was how lives actually worked, not in grand gestures but in specific ordinary moments chosen with as much clarity as you could bring to bear, and the accumulation of those chosen moments becoming something irreducible and whole. Peter read the pages one evening while she was working on something else at the other end of the table, and she heard him go very quiet, and she looked up to find him reading with his elbows on the table and his hands at his temples, and she waited until he looked up. "You should send this somewhere," he said, and his voice was thick in a way he did not attempt to conceal. "I wrote it for us," she said, "and for Eli and Nell. Send it to Thomas first," he said. "Then keep it." She sent it to Thomas, who wrote back to say it was the best thing he had ever read, and that Clara had cried reading it, which Clara confirmed in a separate note that was brief and warm and entirely Clara. They kept it, as Peter had said, in the drawer of the kitchen table where her father's journal had once lived, and it was understood without being stated that it would pass to Eli and Nell in time, and from them to whoever came after. The dawn of the 20th century found the Alden ranch in good order. The land was healthy, the cattle were sound. Miguel's youngest brother had joined the operation in 1899 and was proving as good as Miguel had predicted, and the people who worked and lived on those 600 acres of Wyoming ground were, by any honest accounting, flourishing. Eli was 15 in the year 1900 and spending more time with the horses than with anything else, which his mother understood completely and his father encouraged, and who had recently begun to demonstrate a particular gift for training young horses that Olive recognized as something beyond what she had taught him, something native in him, a language he had been born knowing. She told Peter this on a winter evening, and he listened carefully and said that they should find a way to develop it, that there were good trainers now in Cheyenne who could teach Eli things that neither of them could, and Olive agreed, and they began making plans. Nell was 12 and writing constantly letters, stories, observations with an energy and clarity that made the schoolteacher she had once been feel a particular and specific pride. Nell had her father's directness and her mother's patience, which was an unusual combination and a powerful one, and the Carver schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Caldwell who was excellent at her work, had sent a letter home to say that Nell's compositions were the best she had seen from a student of that age. "She is going to be a writer," Olive said, reading Miss Caldwell's letter aloud at supper. "She is going to be whatever she decides to be," Peter said, "and she is going to do it very loudly." "Papa," Nell said, with the precision of a 12-year-old who has been called loud before. "With great force of personality," Peter amended, and the laughter at that supper table was genuine and full, and the sound of it went out through the warm kitchen window into the cold Wyoming night and mixed with the night sounds of the ranch, the horses in the paddock, the wind off the ridge, the creek running in the dark, and the world was large and cold and full of difficulty and injustice and loss, as it had always been and would go on being. But on this particular evening in this particular kitchen with these particular people, everything that needed to be present was present. Olive looked across the table at Peter, who was still laughing at something Eli had just said in response to Nell's expression, and she felt the love she had for him as a physical substance, as something with real weight and texture, the love of 15 years and counting, of 1,000 mornings and evenings, of hard winters and good springs, of decisions made together and grief shared and daily work and daily choice. And she thought of that dry August afternoon in 1882 and the broken-down horse standing in the ring, and the man who had asked honestly why and the honest answer she had given. She had told him the truth. She had told him she saw more in that animal than what anyone was looking at. She had told him that fear was different from danger. She had meant it about the horse. She had also, she thought, without knowing it yet, been telling him something about herself. That she was a woman who looked for what was underneath the surface, who believed in the thing that was possible even when what was present was broken, who had patience for the work of bringing something back toward what it should be. And he had handed her the rope. He had stood in that ring in the August heat, and he had handed her the rope and said his name, and she had said hers, and everything had followed from that as naturally and inevitably as spring follows winter, not easily, not without labor, but with the certainty of things that are rooted deeply enough in honest ground. She would go on choosing this. She had chosen it every day for 15 years. She would go on choosing it for every year she had left, on this land, beside this man, with this family built from work and love, and the particular kind of courage that is required not for a single dramatic moment, but for the long, ongoing dailiness of a life fully lived and fully meant. And she would go on telling the truth when someone asked her why. It was the only way she knew how to be. It was, she had found, the only way anything real ever started. Outside, the Wyoming night was endless and cold and utterly full of stars, and the creek ran through the dark, and the cottonwood trees she had planted along its bank stood bare and patient in the winter air, waiting for the spring they already knew was coming. The way things that are properly rooted always know that spring is coming, and always wait, and always are right.